Hello, welcome back to Risk Management. Today's topic is determinism, eliminating confounders. We've gotten here because we've been talking about causation, and this is the final element of causation that we need to talk about. It'll be a lengthy topic, but today we're going to talk about the general principle of confounders, what they are, why they're a problem for establishing causation, and how we can be on the lookout for them. To recall where we've come from, this class is about risk. And a working definition that we've given throughout this class is, risk is the probability that a stimulus causes a harmful effect. Well, in order to know risk, we must know causation. And remember, as we've said before, a simple statistical association, seeing two things occurring at the same time, does not mean that there is causation. Association is not causation. What is causation? Causation is a change in a stimulus that determines a directional change in an effect. And thus far we've dealt with these issues head on, talking first about phenomena and how we know in fact that a stimulus or an effect exists, trying to dispel or control for illusions. We also in the last class talked about directionality, being on the lookout for reverse causation. But today we turn to the third element of causation, determination. Or, in other words, we're going to be looking at the issue of trying to control for confounders. Let's get started. What is a confounder? A confounder is an event or change that is associated with both the effect of interest and the suspected stimulus. This is an abstract definition, but I'll repeat it one time. A confounder is an event or change that is associated with both the effect of interest and the suspected stimulus. In order to see this play out, we have to understand there's actually two different types of confounders. One are what are called positive confounders. Positive confounders are events or changes that make the association between the suspected stimulus and the suspected effect appear stronger than it really is. Conversely, negative confounders are events or changes that make the association between the suspected stimulus and effect appear weaker than it really is. In either circumstance, what a confounder does is it distorts our perception of causation. It causes us to believe that an association really is causation, or in circumstances otherwise, when it's a negative confounder, that a true causal relationship in fact does not exist at all. I think this is best explained through examples, and so we're going to work through a number of these today to gain some comfort and understanding about this. There are as many confounders as the day is long, and it is often very hard to control for these. One question you should be asking yourself by the end of today's lecture is, how in fact do we control for confounders? That will be the subject of many future lectures, and we'll come to that. But today, we're simply trying to understand, how do we recognize a confounder? Let's start with an example. At 10 a.m., a woman sprints to the bus stop. At 10:01 a.m., a bus drives up and the woman climbs aboard. Let's ask a causal question. Did the fact that the woman started sprinting cause the bus to arrive? Or maybe we could ask the reverse causation question. Remember in the last class we talked about directionality. Perhaps the bus's movement caused the woman to start sprinting to the bus stop. Some of you might say, yes, that's the case. The woman saw the bus coming, and because she was behind, she started running as she saw the bus coming on. Let's pretend that the woman didn't see the bus. And conversely, that the woman's sprint obviously didn't cause the bus to arrive. What is the cause of the fact that the woman sprinted and the bus arrived? There's a confounder here, namely the bus schedule. The bus was due to arrive at 10, or maybe 10:01, and the woman likewise was due to arrive at 10 or 10:01, not because the bus was coming, or not because the woman was coming, but because both of them knew of the bus schedule, and the bus schedule had prearranged for both of them to arrive at 10 a.m. This is an example of a confounder. Let's find another one. Here's an example. Frequent gambling is linked to a higher incidence of liver disease and various forms of cancer. Can we conclude from that statement that gambling causes these diseases? Here you've seen a picture of a roulette table, and there's an arrow depicting a sick person at the other end of the arrow. This is the directionality I was talking about earlier. Gambling causes sickness. The arrow denotes the concept of cause in a specific direction, as opposed to sickness causes gambling, in which case the arrow would go in the opposite direction. Okay, so can you think of confounders in this circumstance? Reasons why this association, where gambling is linked to a higher incidence of liver disease and various forms of cancer, might not actually be causation. Here's a quick aside. When you see the word linked, oftentimes people will say that and it gives an impression of causation, but we should always be on the lookout that the word linked only denotes association, not causation. And as we know, association is not causation. So, what do we say about this? Well, one reason that we might not be able to immediately conclude that gambling causes cancer from this association is we have to control for the confounder of drinking and smoking. Drinking and smoking is linked both with gambling and with illness. Could it be the fact that while people are gambling, they are also smoking or drinking? Perhaps that confounder is causing this association between gambling and illness to appear stronger than it actually is. So, we can say that there are potential confounders here. Alcohol consumption and smoking are common among gamblers. Alcohol is a known cause of cancer and liver disease, as well as smoking causes various forms of cancer. Also, never forget directionality in this issue. Reverse causation has to be ruled out too, besides confounders, in order to know about causation. Could we say, for example, what the restatement of reverse causation would be here? Look back at the example. The arrow flows from gambling to sickness. What would be reverse causation? It would be sickness leads to gambling. And indeed, maybe that is true. Maybe people with terminal illnesses have nothing to lose, and so they go gamble. We have to rule that out too in order to know causation. This is an example of positive causation, where alcohol and smoking make the relationship between gambling and illness look stronger than it otherwise would be if we were to control for alcohol and smoking. What we might want to ask is it the case that among non-smokers or non-drinkers who gamble, that their incidence of liver disease or cancer is higher? That would be an interesting study, because it would control for the confounders. Okay, let's take another example. It's a fact that depression is common among caregivers for terminally ill patients. Does this mean that caregiving causes depression? Here we see the arrow again. Caregiving is the stimulus, causes the effect of depression in the caregiver. Is that the case? Or have we ruled out all possible confounders? We need to think about this before we can make the conclusion that this association is in fact causation. Here's a couple of facts. Fact number 1, women have a higher incidence of depression than men. And fact number 2, most caregivers for the terminally ill are women. A conclusion we can reach from this is that gender is a positive confounder for caregiving and depression. Do you see why? If it is a variable associated with both the proposed stimulus, caregiving, and the proposed effect, depression, then we have to control for gender in order to know whether the incidence of depression is really caused by caregiving. Okay, there are other variables besides gender that we might want to take into account before we can automatically conclude that caregiving for the terminally ill causes depression? What other factors could you think of that we might need to control for? Well, one example could be the age of the caregiver. Oftentimes, elderly people tend to be caregivers more than younger people. That's because elderly people who caregive for the terminally ill are often spouses. They too are elderly because they're caring for the elderly. Elderly people also tend to be depressed. So here, just like in the case of gender, if we don't control for the age of the caregiver, we might mistake what in fact is the causal relationship. Or, income of a caregiver is another positive confounder. Caregivers tend to be of lower income, and lower income workers also tend to be depressed. This is a positive confounder. If we don't control for income, we can make a mistake about concluding that the association between caregiving and depression is in fact causation. Another possible positive confounder is whether it's a family member caring for the terminally ill patient or instead a professional caregiver. Family members have emotional attachments to their family independent of the caregiving status and might therefore be depressed not because of the caregiving, but because a relative is sick. That too could be a positive confounder. You can think of many, many more, I suspect. In fact, that might be a good discussion question for the chat boards. Can you think of other confounders in this possible causal relationship? Also, don't forget to rule out reverse causation in this case. We had always picked the directionality of this to be that caregiving causes depression, but could depression cause one to become a caregiver? Well, there is a story you could tell about this, saying that depressed people may try to become caretakers in order to forget their own woes. And if that's the case, then perhaps the causation runs in the opposite direction that we've been suspecting. Okay, let's take another example of confounding. There's the water fluoridation in cancer controversy, which has been going on since 1945. Many U.S. cities decided to fluoridate their water to prevent dental problems for their populaces. And in 10 U.S. cities in the 1970s, initiation of government-mandated fluoridation of water was linked with a rapid, statistically significant increase in the number of cancers in those 10 cities. So not only was there a link between cancer and the fluoridation of water, but the rise in cancer occurred very sharply and quickly after the introduction of fluoride into the water. So this was a very strong and striking and spontaneous association that came on quickly. Protesters who had conducted these studies argued that this association they had discovered was strong proof that fluoridation was causing additional cancer among drinkers of the water. What do you think? Did drinking water cause cancer? Well, we can't conclude that, or at least you shouldn't, until you've ruled out confounders. It turned out that at the same time the fluoridation of the water was going on in those cities, there were rapid mass influxes or in-migration of elderly people as well as African Americans. Both of these groups tend to have elevated rates of cancer, irrespective of what water they drink. After investigators had controlled in their studies for race and age, they discovered that the cancer death rate had actually dropped in the cities since the introduction of fluoride into the water supplies. So here we see that not only were these positive confounders creating a stronger impression of the cancer, but that when we controlled for those, for whatever reason, the cancer rates had dropped after fluoride was put in the water. We couldn't automatically conclude from that, however, that fluoridating the water causes people to be protected against cancer either. That too is only an association, not causation. Okay, let's go on to another possibility of confounders. In this case, instead of talking about positive confounders, let's talk about a negative confounder. Remember, a negative confounder causes evidence of a suspected causal relationship to appear weaker than it actually should. In other words, what a negative confounder does is it masks a true causal relationship by taking away the link that appears in association. It makes an association appear to vanish, where there actually might be causation. Here's an example because it's a bit confusing if we don't see one. And even when you see this example, you might want to review it once because it's subtle, and negative confounders can sometimes be harder to spot than positive confounders. For women who take birth control, there is no statistically significant increased risk of thrombosis, which is clotting of the blood, which can lead to potential risks of stroke or heart attack. So here we see, for example, women taking birth control, the pill. And what has been found is that when women take the pill, there have been studies to see whether they get blood clotting, leading to potential stroke or heart attacks. And those studies have found no evidence of increased risk of thrombosis as a result of taking the pill. Okay, does that mean we can automatically conclude that birth control does not cause thrombosis? Well, to get to that, we have to actually ask whether there are negative confounders. Because here we've ruled out causation and said there is no causation, but a negative confounder could be lurking somewhere. And before we can rule out causation, we need to think about negative confounders. Well, let's look at a diagram. Even though we have this information that women who take birth control have no statistically significant increase in the risk of thrombosis, could we tell a story somehow that birth control might still increase the risk of thrombosis? Here's how it might go. The story is this. We're asking, does birth control increase the risk of thrombosis? One other factor we have to take into account that's obvious about birth control is it decreases the risk, if you want to call it that, of pregnancy. Could birth control, as a result, increase the risk of thrombosis independent of pregnant women, but decrease it because it prevents pregnancy? Let's look at this another way. Here's the diagram. On one side of this, birth control blocks pregnancy. That's the red arrow, meaning it doesn't happen. And if pregnancy increases the risk of thrombosis, which it does, then maybe because birth control blocks pregnancy, pregnancy doesn't occur in people who are on birth control, and therefore the risk of thrombosis goes down, where people do not get pregnant. But if birth control also, here's the red X's indicate that because pregnancy is not occurring, there's no thrombosis. But what if birth control also independently increases the risk of thrombosis? That is, I could restate this in the following way. If somebody came to me as a patient and I were an OB-GYN trying to prescribe birth control, and the patient asked, "Doctor, will I have an increased risk of thrombosis by taking birth control?" A realistic answer might be the following. Well, it depends. If you become pregnant, then birth control will increase your risk of thrombosis. But if, while taking the pill, you don't become pregnant, then your overall risk of thrombosis goes down. In other words, maybe birth control independently raises the risk of thrombosis, but overall, if we don't control for pregnancy as a factor, the overall risk of thrombosis goes down. So here, pregnancy is a negative confounder. It hides the fact that birth control causes an independent risk of thrombosis. And here's where it gets even more complicated in all of this measure. For a single association, there can be both positive and negative confounders. Here's an example. Take the fact that the incidence of heart attacks is inversely related to one's weekly amount of cardiovascular exercise. That is, if I exercise more, it's observed that it is linked with a decrease in the number of heart attacks. Remember, linkage means association, and association is not causation. But we could ask the question, does exercising mean my risk of heart attacks goes down? Well, there are actually both positive and negative confounders to this statement. What's a positive confounder? Can you think of one? Here's one, and I challenge you to think of others. How about age? Young people tend to exercise more than the elderly, and For reasons unrelated to exercise, but simply because they're young people tend to have fewer heart attacks. So if you don't control for age, the effect of exercise in reducing heart attacks in young people will look stronger than it really is. Conversely, the effect will look weaker in those elderly who do choose to exercise. This is a positive confounder, just like the examples we gave before. And there's also a potential negative confounder here. What's that? Can you think of one? How about gender? Men tend to get more heart attacks than women, regardless of how much they exercise. And men tend to exercise more than women. So if you don't control for gender in this study, the effect of exercise on heart attacks in men will actually look weaker than it really is. Wow. Subtlety comes in here, and these confounders can add up quickly. We've only given a few examples, but many more could exist and be lurking. So, what do we want to conclude from today? To know causation, you must establish determination. That is, you have to eliminate confounders. You also have to eliminate reverse causation, directionality, which we talked about in the last lecture. This is a very complex and nuanced topic, and we're going to talk more about it in future lectures. What I hope you'll be asking at the end of today is, how do we get rid of confounders? And do so knowing that so many possibly could exist. That will be the talk of a future lecture. I look forward to seeing you on the chat boards.